Hey guys, welcome back to Horsetooth Cinema. We're finally in October, the best month of the year as far as I'm concerned, movie-wise. I'll be reviewing some horror films, some favorites of mine on here pretty soon, but right now I actually want to do a little catch-up for some of the releases that I may have missed reviewing back in September. So we've got a triple feature here, and I'll go ahead and get right into it with Pearl. This is the much anticipated prequel to X, which stars Mia Goth as Pearl, a young woman who is trapped on her family's farm during the Spanish flu. She has dreams of being in movies, but her overbearing mother really wants her to accept her life on the farm. Torn between her desires and a repressive family of hers, she starts to unravel in a really horrific way. It's kind of crazy that we're getting this sequel to X so soon, and I don't know when Maxine, the third film, is going to come out, but really looking forward to that one as well. X, I reviewed it when it came out. It was a film I really enjoyed, just as a movie experience, but it did leave something to be desired for me in terms of just the tonal consistency with the horror. And I also felt that a lot of the older slasher characters in the movie weren't very sympathetic when the movie clearly wanted them to be sympathetic, and so that aspect of it didn't really work for me. The things that really stuck out about Pearl were the slasher elements, all the horror craft of it that I think Ti West just really understands as a genre filmmaker. And also just the great performance by Mia Goth in the film. And I'm just gonna say right off the bat, I like Pearl way more than X. I think it was an improvement on X in pretty much every way. As I mentioned with X, the tone of the horror I felt was just really odd. So it advertised itself as this gritty return to sort of 70s slasher movies, a la stuff like Friday the 13th would be the 80s, but then, you know, stuff like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, sort of exploitation films. That's what it was advertising itself as on the surface. And then you watch it and it has a lot of this weird A24 art house droning throughout a lot of it that again, tonally, it just felt kind of off for me. And I appreciated that tonally, Pearl is just a lot more confident in what it is. It's this really bizarre blend of like Wizard of Oz, sort of Technicolor pop, and really, really grotesque, filthy horror. Like I said, but especially when I saw the trailer, I was reminded of Wizard of Oz quite a bit. But when I watched the movie itself, I was reminded a little bit more of something like David Lynch's Blue Velvet, which has this really sort of shiny Americana surface. But then literally in the first shot, it transitions from that to a severed ear laying in the grass being eaten by worms. And there's an image in Pearl that I think is very reminiscent of something like that. Story-wise, I mentioned in my Letterboxd review that I think this is, it kind of reminded me of a mix of something like Carrie, the Brian De Palma film, with something like Scorsese's King of Comedy in a weird way. It takes the idea of the eruption of a repressed character that something like Carrie has, and it combines that with the sort of delusional rise to stardom that exists in Scorsese's King of Comedy. Pearl has all these dreams about making it in show business, but because of the nature of her repressive background, especially with her mother, she doesn't have a normal idea of what that is. She doesn't think about it in the way that a normal person would. Her idea of that is much more perverse, and we see that in the early scene where she's out dancing in the field with the scarecrow, and then that transitions into her just dry humping the scarecrow, which is a great scene. But as the movie goes on, the tone of this becomes much more sinister. It becomes not just about her sort of sexual freedom, but also about combining violence with that. And I think that is just a really cool idea of, you know, blending those sort of trashy genre elements into a film that is essentially about a character trying to become her own person. By the end of the film, it sort of does feel like that scene towards the end of Carrie, where Carrie is finally punishing all of her high school oppressors. Mia Goth is absolutely the best part of this film. She is astoundingly good. Might be my favorite performance of the year so far. And speaking of Carrie, I mean, she really reminds me a lot of Sissy Spacek in that movie, or Sissy Spacek in something like Badlands, Terrence Malick's film, in that she's this, you know, more unconventionally beautiful character, but also just has this hidden pain that you can always see in her face. And obviously as the film goes on, it becomes much less hidden, especially in the final shot of the film when they transition to credits, which I just thought was great. Where X was, you know, struggling to make me feel sympathy for the character of Pearl, in the movie Pearl, I really do get a lot more of that sympathy that I really felt that I needed from that character. you really do feel her pain. And when the violence finally manifests, even though she does things that are probably even more sinister than what she does in X, you sort of understand it, and you can sort of, I don't want to say sympathize with it, but you can, again, sort of understand where she's coming from. So yeah, I liked Pearl a lot more than X. I thought it was an improvement on it in every way. It's actually one of my favorite films of the year so far. Maybe my favorite conventional horror film. So I'm gonna give it 4.5 stars. I really loved it. Next, I'm gonna be talking about Don't Worry Darling, which is the new film by Olivia Wilde. It's about a 1950s housewife who lives in a utopian community. And she begins to suspect that her glamorous village may be hiding something very sinister. I really, really liked Olivia Wilde's debut, Booksmart. I thought, though it was really small scale, obviously, I thought it was just a really honest and, unpretentious, not preachy sort of coming-of-age film, which is kind of rare these days. So naturally, after liking that film, I was really excited to see what she would do stepping into sort of a more genre film, kind of a thriller. And unfortunately, after all this drama, especially with Harry Styles, that I just frankly don't care to follow, Don't Worry Darling is just kind of the moviest movie that came out this year. I certainly admire the craft and sort of the ambition that Wilde went to in her second feature. This is obviously much larger scale. The budget's a lot bigger. There is a more tangible world being developed here. Again, I sort of admire the scale of it. But beyond that, I think that a lot of the elements here, just from the writing, the direction, the score, which I'll talk about, I think a lot of it is just really painfully derivative of other better films. And it just wasn't very impactful overall. Obviously, this movie takes a lot from The Stepford Wives, mainly just kind of the premise, I would say, is the main part of it. But there's also a lot here ripped straight from one of my favorite movies the last few years, which is Possessor. The score in particular of Don't Worry Darling has a lot of the same kind of voice droning, if that makes any sense, that the score to Possessor has, which is really unfashionable, given just that the films share so much in terms of when you finally get to the twist of Don't Worry Darling and you learn what's going on here, it is pretty similar to what happens in Possessor. I also naturally thought a lot about Get Out, Jordan Peele's 2017 film, which I love. And though Get Out also borrows a lot from movies like The Stepford Wives, I felt that what Get Out was doing in terms of making its own commentary on the sort of Stepford Wives story by transitioning into the more racism elements of it were a lot more interesting. It was using the Stepford Wives formula, but also coming up with its unique message about white liberals sort of fetishizing the bodies of younger black people, and the sort of very subtle racism that appears in the real world from white liberals. I just don't feel like Don't Worry Darling had that kind of statement to make. The general statement felt very paint by the numbers. And when you finally put the full picture together beyond just the basic premise of it, when you get to the specifics of the twist, it just feels a little bit muddled and underwhelming. Also, a lot of people have called the twist predictable as hell. I don't really think that's the case. I think that when you're watching the movie, you're thinking of all the different directions that this could go in, and your mind probably comes up with something like what the twist ends up being. Maybe not exactly that, but when you get there, you're just kind of like, oh, okay, so that's what they did. And it doesn't really recontextualize everything else that you've seen. It's not like when the twist hits in Get Out, and you're completely like, oh, of course, this had to be what we've been building to the whole time. Everything else that I've seen prior to this makes sense. It wasn't really like that. It was just sort of like, oh, okay, they went in this direction. All right. And I'm not just trying to trash like movies that are totally, have these like derivative twists. I mean, I think that sometimes movies can have a lot of fun with that. I think I've talked on here before about Stephen Knight's Serenity, which is admittedly it's a great movie. Came out in 2019. Awesome movie. That movie has a very derivative twist that just kind of seems stupid when you first watch it. But the thing is, like, the execution of it as the movie goes on, the movie has a lot of just goofy fun with it. It's completely unhinged in the way that it handles it. So if Don't Worry Darling did something a bit more in that direction where you can kind of enjoy it in almost a campy way, I would have appreciated it more. But it didn't really. It just kind of felt, again, very paint by the numbers, sort of honestly kind of boring. Don't Worry Darling isn't awful by any means, but just given, again, how derivative it is and how underwhelmed I was by it, I'm just kind of surprised it's generated the amount of drama that it has. I'm gonna give it 2 stars. And finally, we're gonna be talking about another film that has generated quite the amount of drama and controversy, and that is Andrew Dominik's Blonde. A lot of people have been referring to this as a Marilyn Monroe biopic. It's not a biopic. It is an adaptation of a fictional account of Marilyn Monroe's life. And it's a lot more of a commentary on celebrity and on trauma, etc., which I'll get into. But it tells the story of Norma Jean through her childhood and her rise to stardom and romantic entanglements that she experiences at the time. Hearing a lot of the drama about this film when the reviews first started to pour in, I kind of expected that I would really, really like it. And that's, you know, because I'd heard it was very different from the sort of standard Hollywood biopic formula, which, you know, I talked about in my Elvis review. I think too many films still suffer from that today. And especially now that the audience reviews are in, it's really getting bashed. I think it has like a 2.1 on Letterboxd. Like it's really been slammed. And a lot of people are just calling it very exploitative. And I'll get into, you know, why I can understand why that they're calling it that. I don't agree. But I think Bohemian Rhapsody is a much more exploitative film than Blonde. Bohemian Rhapsody, you know, took an actor like Rami Malek and dressed him up in the clothes and skin of Freddie Mercury, simply for the point of reenacting the very Cliff Notes, again, paint by the numbers details of his life, as opposed to giving us any insight as to who he actually was as a person, or showing us any of the filth of sort of his trauma. And the struggles he had in his life. It just felt like a really long-winded way of saying, remember Freddie Mercury? And, you know, thankfully Blonde does not do that. It does not take that approach. And so I don't, in that way, I think, you know, Bohemian Rhapsody is much more exploitative than Blonde is. Blonde, in a lot of ways, isn't even necessarily a film about Marilyn Monroe. I mean, it's the title of it, for one, is not Marilyn, it's Blonde. It's about a celebrity symbol. Now, it is, of course, using this very particular symbol so that we can sort of identify with it. But yeah, I think it's more about the ideas itself and less about the people. So while this is a really bold film, as I'll get into, I did struggle with it quite a bit. The problem with Blonde is not that it's, you know, very violent and brutal to its main character, or that it takes liberties with the life of the real person. I think both of those things are really good ideas and they serve the film well. What I don't like about the film at all is how ridiculously on the nose it is. There's a lot of it where they're going for this sort of Freudian metaphor about how Marilyn never knew her dad and there's sort of trauma that results from that, which I think people can take as a, you know, as an idea that's based in reality. It's something that real people could experience. But the film, you know, it uses a lot of, like she calls all of these men in her life daddy to sort of illustrate that metaphor. It's just so ridiculously obvious and on the nose. And there are songs in the film on the soundtrack that accompany this idea. When they first introduce Marilyn as an adult, they're playing a song that features the word daddy in it over and over again. And it's just like, why did you choose to be this obvious about it? Especially when the movie is trying to make this much broader, really interesting commentary about celebrity. I just did not understand why they had to be that obvious about it. The cinematography of this movie and the production design have been praised, well, you know, deservingly, I think, by a lot of people. But a lot of the images that it's creating, again, are just very, like, cookie cutter. And therefore they just feel a little bit hollow and empty sometimes. And this is especially a problem because the movie is presenting itself as this very innovative change-up of the Hollywood biopic formula, which is a great idea, but if you don't back it up with really dense, you know, bold imagery, it doesn't work. But that's not to say the film isn't innovative in some way. It definitely is. I really love the central idea of it. The tagline on the poster is basically watched by all, seen by none, referring to Marilyn, of course. And I think a lot of people went into the film with the idea of, like, that sentence is going to finish with watched by all, seen by none, until now, because it's a biopic. But Andrew Dominik is very clearly choosing not to do that. The entire point of this is that celebrity is dumb. It's you know, the idea that we could reduce the entire life of a person to a 2-hour biopic simply because we know them from a persona that they put up in the public is a really dumb idea. There's no way we can really understand the real Norma Jean. So why pretend? I really like that idea. Instead, what he chooses to focus on is the much more tragic elements of her trauma that comes with the glitzy aspect of celebrity. Probably my favorite scene in the movie is this scene where Norma is sitting in front of her dressing room mirror, and she's trying to conjure Marilyn because she needs to personify Marilyn for this performance she's about to put on. And it really is like watching something like The Exorcist or just, yeah, any sort of possession movie, because when Marilyn comes up, it looks completely horrific and unnatural. And I think that's what Andrew Dominik is ultimately trying to say about what celebrity does to an individual person. And I think a lot of the brutality that comes throughout the film, I mean, yes, it is very extreme at times, but I think it's necessary to really get that idea of this trauma of celebrity across. And I think, though the execution is very on the nose at times, I think often it does genuinely get the ideas across well. People are complaining in their reviews on Letterboxd a lot that we don't get to see Marilyn beyond her trauma. But I think that's precisely the point, again. The idea behind celebrity is that we reduce a person with all of their nuances and quirks to just a symbol. And all that we leave them with, and what we experience in the film is the sort of trauma that comes with the lack of identity or the loss of identity that's been stolen by celebrity. I think that idea of it is really great, and I think people need to revisit this, because I think the reviews have just been way over the top, like in terms of how much people are bashing it. I'm not going to defend Blonde as some sort of empathetic masterpiece akin to something like David Lynch's Fire Walk With Me or Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, because it's just very plainly not nearly as well made as films like that. But I do think that the hate that it's been getting is way overblown, and I think that people should consider, when they talk about this movie as being exploitative, they should consider how exploitative the general Hollywood biopic formula is, movies like Elvis or Bohemian Rhapsody. So yeah, I appreciated a lot of aspects of Blonde. Overall, I would say that I liked a lot of the ideas that it accomplished. I just think that a lot of them were executed very poorly in a lot of ways. And so I'm gonna give it 3 stars. I think it's worth your time to check out. It's an interesting phenomenon, to say the least. It's definitely not the best movie of the year. It's not the worst, but it's one of the most notable for sure. So anyway, that's my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, please like it down below and subscribe to the channel if you want. I've got some, for this October, I definitely want to do some like horror retrospective movie reviews. I recently just went to a theater and revisited John Carpenter's The Thing. So I think that's one that I really, really would like to review for you guys soon. So yeah, stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya!